Hey guys, so I'm going to be presenting wind power today, and I'm Patrick, your physics event captain. So we're gonna start off with what is wind power. Well, wind power is it's a two-person event. It's a building and testing event. So the building portion of the event is going to be trying to design and create a wind turbine to catch and generate as much wind as possible. So you're trying to build the most efficient wind turbine within the regulations so that you can make as much power as you can. But there's also a written portion of wind power, which is the written test. And that written test is going to be on physics and wind power related topics. So wind power related topics being like history or like anything related to wind power, such as when was the first windmill created, or what are the components of a windmill, or what are pros and cons of using different materials. Now moving on to the event parameters of wind power. So there's a building portion, of course, which is creating the most efficient wind turbine that you can, which will be 50% of your score. And to do that, you're gonna attach blades onto a 12 centimeter CD, and the maximum radius that your blades can be, so it's from the center of the CD measured outward. So the maximum radius that it can be is 14 centimeters because we're in Division C, which is the high school division. And your goal is to try to generate as much voltage as possible. However, there are some regulations on the use of materials, such as how you can't use any hazardous materials like metal, which would hurt people when spinning at a really high speed. And also, there's the testing portion. So the testing portion is going to be, as I mentioned before, a variety of physics and wind power related questions that you would have to research on your own. But you have a 3-ring binder that you can bring so that you don't have to memorize all of these concepts or like statistics and things like that. So your binder is going to be key, and during the competition, the 3-ring binder needs to be secure, meaning that if you turn it over, things won't fall out, there can't be any loose papers, things like that. And as for the testing, there's going to be some time constraints. So you and your partner are going to have to work together to complete the test on time. So also make sure to organize your binder accordingly, like putting labels or sorting it in a specific way so that you know for any particular question how you'll get the answer by your research. And hold on 1 second. Checking on. And as for the building of the wind turbine itself, there are a lot of factors to consider, such as like the wind turbine diameter. Since we're in Division C, of course, like I mentioned before, there's going to be a 14 centimeter radius maximum. So from my personal experience, you want to go up to the maximum radius, but of course you wouldn't want to go over, because during a competition you would have to modify on the spot if you were a little bit over. So you want to keep it at about 13.9 centimeters radius, just to be safe. And of course, with the wind turbine's weight, you want to make it as light as possible, but also making sure that the blades aren't too flimsy, because you're going to have high speed winds being blown at it, and you want to make sure that the blades don't deform itself. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to consistently create a lot of power with high speed winds. Also, you want to consider the blade width and thickness. Like I mentioned before, you want to have it thick enough to withstand the force applied to the blades, so that the blades do not bend, but also making sure that it's thin and light enough to spin at a very high speed. So creating your wind turbine is really about balancing and making sure that, and also making sure that your wind turbine is consistent and it doesn't break on the spot. Also, you want to consider the curve of the blade, and because the curve of the blade would determine how much wind you're trying to make it spin or how much you're trying to catch. So that would also be related to the blade pitch, because if wind is being blown on the turbine, you want to make it rotate. You want to try to make it rotate, and so you need enough pitch so that it can rotate smoothly, but also not too much that it creates drag and actually slows the turbine down. So like I mentioned before, building the turbine is key components of building the turbine are trying to balance the weight with stability, also balancing the pitch so that there's not too much drag, but also that there's enough horizontal motion to keep it there's enough horizontal force to keep it spinning as fast as it can. Also, from my personal experience, the number of blades on the turbine itself, I feel like 3 has worked the best, but I have seen turbines that have worked with 4. But from personal experience and seeing around, I've seen that 3 tends to work the best. Also, the blade material is pretty important, because you want to create the lightest but also most durable material that can withstand the strong winds. And as you can see here, this was a very early prototype over here, made with cardboard wings. And if you can see kind of closely, there's we used our hands to deform the blades a little bit so that it would catch the winds but also spin the turbine in a circular motion. So, with the wind turbine itself, some things that you want to consider while creating the wind turbine itself is that you want to try a variety of turbines. So once you try the variety, you're gonna find one version that seems to work the best, whether it be with material, shape of the turbine, or things like that. And once you have that one perfect version, or almost perfect, you want to try considering the angles, the angle of the pitch, as I mentioned before, because the angle of the pitch will be a strong component of how much power you can generate. And also, the wind turbines themselves will also be very fragile, because generally they're very lightweight, and since they're very lightweight, they're really easy to bend. So if you don't keep them in safe conditions, they could break very easily. So you want to keep spare ones just in case, always. And let me show you an example of a wind turbine here. So you would see here that you have a voltmeter so that you can measure how much voltage you're actually generating, and also a box fan so that you can consistently pour air. And you can see that there is the wind turbine right over there. And you can see that when the fan is turned on, the turbine is able to spin and generate a voltage. So of course your goal here is trying to make it spin as fast as possible, and to do so you're just designing the wings. That is the key component of wind power. So going back to the wind turbine. Of course, it's not just an engineering event, there's also a testing portion to this. There's the written test, which we will be screening for during the testing of wind power. So, some topics, but not all. There are a lot of topics that are covered in wind power. So there are topics like alternative forms of energy, physics concepts, and the use of formulas. And some physics concepts include kinematics, power generation, heat transfer, all things that you'll be able to get formulas for. And let me just show you one key component for getting formulas. So this is the AP Physics 1 formula sheet that all AP test takers are given. So this includes all of the formulas in AP Physics 1, as well as a different page for AP Physics 2. So this demonstrates all of the mechanics, all these formulas, and also tells you how they are used. So a question could give you some variables which relate to all of these names, and you would need to know what formula to plug it into, of course. But of course, beforehand you would need to study these formulas and kind of know how they're used, because again, you are under some time constraints. And going back to the written test. So you should also keep track of statistics of energy consumption, which will be part of your 3-ring binder. And there are a lot of statistics, which is why you're gonna need to create a large binder so that you can keep statistics of local energy consumption, international energy consumption. Like a question could possibly ask you, what is the main source of energy in Texas? So that would be a very specific question, but of course if you had thorough notes, then you would be able to find that very quickly. And also there's the history of wind turbines in general, so a question could ask, like, who created the first wind turbine? Which would be a very specific question, but of course with your binder you should be able to find that. And also topics about wind power turbine designs, which would consist of horizontal axis wind turbines, vertical axis wind turbines, and etc. So there are multiple wind turbine designs, but the horizontal and vertical axis wind turbine designs are currently the most popular for commercial use currently. And also some other topics would be power storage or power loss and transmission. So how much power, so power loss and transmission would be under physics because it's talking about the resistance in some cables, so how much power would be lost by transmitting a certain amount through a cable. So a sample problem of this would be possibly list 3 advantages and disadvantages of using a horizontal wind turbine versus a vertical axis wind turbine. So the question would be testing multiple things. First, it would be testing. Do you know what HAWT is? And if you've done thorough research, you would know that an HAWT would be a horizontal axis wind turbine, and a VAWT would be a vertical axis wind turbine. So this is what a VAWT would look like, and this would be the classical horizontal axis wind turbine. So some advantages and disadvantages you could find, but you could find by Googling, of course, or I have a page open right now with the pros and cons of horizontal versus vertical axis wind turbines. So what I would do is I would just copy this image, but make sure you thoroughly look through it before you copy the image and paste it into your notes so that you have this chart which will give you the pros and cons of having a horizontal or vertical axis wind turbine. So that's how you're going to be building up your notes, and you would also want to keep track of these formulas. I know it's a lot of formulas, but a lot of them will be relevant, and if you know all of these formulas, you should be able to answer most of the physics related questions, especially some relating to resistance. Should be here. So yeah, there will be a lot of questions on like resistance. So I know that to most of you, this formula looks very ambiguous. But if you look over here, in most questions you would be given all of these variables and you would just need to identify them and their units. So you would also need to know the units of a lot of these variables, like how power would be measured in watts or charge would be measured in coulombs, because they would give you a number with the variable. They would give you a number with the unit and you would have to translate it to a variable. And moving on from the sample problem. So there are a lot of resources available, like I mentioned before. There's the AP Physics 1 and AP Physics 2 formula sheets, which will give you a lot of formulas for the physics related side. And also, if you're interested in learning the concepts in depth, there's a physics textbook that you could use, which would be the College Physics 9.1 textbook, which would be on this link. You can either view it online or get a PDF of it here. And that should cover a lot of the physics questions. But also, a key component would be Googling a lot of topics, because a lot of the topics will be very broad and about all sorts of different topics, so you'll need to be looking up a lot of things related to history or physics or any sort of topic. So in addition to that, you can also access the test bank of Science Olympiad, which should be over here. So if you look over here, this is the 2016 test exchange. So you can just look for wind power and you can see all of these tests that you're able to do. And you could take one trial test and maybe see how well you do and grade it on your own. And then after thorough preparation, you could take another practice test and just track your progress through that. So the Scioly.org archives will be your friend for all practice test related things if you want to look for them. Also, I think we have some practice tests in our resource portal. I'm not sure if they're there yet, but they should be there. So some frequently asked questions would be, how would screening work for wind power? Well, for wind power, since it's an engineering and testing event, screening will primarily be testing. So it'll be testing your physics concepts, your research, all your notes for wind power related topics. But also during the interview, if you want, you can bring a model or a sketch of your wind power design if you'd like. It would give you a lot higher chances to be on the team. But of course that's not required. And another question would be, what material should I use for my wings? And some materials I could recommend would be, with prototypes, you could use cardboard, but of course you'd want to use thinner and thinner cardboard. Or you could use very thick paper that isn't easily bendable by wind. And for me, during competition, I used very thin cardboard, which was very sturdy and easily bendable, and it kept the pitch that I set it at even after multiple trials. So the material needs to be durable and light, which is very hard to find sometimes. And again, like I mentioned before, how many wings should be on the turbine? From my experience, it's generally three. 3 wings would work the best, but I have seen 4 wings work pretty well as well. But your goal is to minimize weight and try to maximize the amount that you're able to rotate the turbine with a certain amount of wind. So another thing during testing, during the during the testing itself, there's going to be, for the wind turbine testing, there's going to be high speed voltage and there's going to be low speed voltage tests. So it'll be testing it against high speed winds, which will be really fast. So that's why your turbine needs to be durable, but also low speed. So your turbine needs to be able to catch enough air so that it can spin. Because one thing in the parameters is that if it does not spin for 30 seconds after wind is being applied to it, then it's automatically stopped and there will be no score counted for that. So you want to make sure that your turbine is able to start with both low and high speeds. So if you guys have any other questions, you can email me or any of the other officers, but I'll try to answer any questions in the live stream right now. So Gautam asked, is this event only an engineering event? No, it's an engineering and testing event, so it's going to include physics topics as well, and all wind power and history, such related topics. And he also asked, how can I get the abstract concepts of physics required for the written tests? So for the written tests, a lot of the physics will be wind power related, so my advice would be trying to just build up a formula database so that you know how to use what formula in what scenario with what information you're given. And sometimes you'll be given 1 missing variable or 2 missing variables, so you might need to use multiple formulas, or you could just use one formula a lot of times. But as for the written tests, again, a lot of the tests would be asking questions like, what are the parts of the what are the parts of a wind turbine, or who created the first wind turbine. There are a lot of questions that are also non-physics related. And if you guys are worried about the physics portion because maybe you haven't taken AP Physics 1 in school yet or had any exposure to physics, just try to build up your formula database, and the screening will primarily be testing your research rather than your physics, because my screening tests made sure that included a lot of the research components rather than the physics, because usually it's split half and half, mainly half physics, half concept questions about wind turbines and how to efficiently create one, things like that. And if there are no other questions, I guess I'll just end the stream now. And good luck with screening.